Welcome back. So we're in chapter 16 on page 382, but I actually want to move over to page 383 in the section called Criteria Used by the Courts for Determining an Employment Status. Sometimes whether somebody is an employee or whether they're an independent contractor is not always clear. So sometimes, for example, in a workers' compensation case where an employee, or I should say an agent, is hurt on the job and they want to be considered an employee, and the employer wants them to be considered an independent contractor so they don't have to pay any workers' compensation fees, well, then the agent then sues to try to be considered an employee, and it's up to the court to decide, well, is this person an independent contractor or is this person an employee? And so what does the court look at when trying to make that determination? Well, the court looks at several factors. The most important, though, is how much control does the principal have over the agent? How much do they control their daily activities? Are they given certain things that they must do during the day, and also how to do those activities? If a principal executes a lot of control, it used to be absolute control when we had our master-servant relationship, but that threshold is no longer required. It's mostly substantial control over an agent, then more often than not, that is going to be an employee. But if the principal only gives general guidelines as to how a job should be finished, or just simply states that this is the job, finish it however you like, then it's probably going to be considered an independent contractor. But what if it's not clear whether it was just general guidelines or whether there was more substantial control? Well, then the court goes into several other factors. The next one is the occupation distinct from the employer's main source of business? Now, what does this mean? For example, think of a shoe store. A shoe store's main business is selling shoes, but the shoe store also hires, every so often, a handyman to help fix things around the store. Well, the handyman, if that's his occupation, he may be considered an independent contractor. Why? Because his role and his duties may fall outside of the scope of the regular business activities of the shoe store. It would be much different if it was a shoe salesman. The court would be more often to look at saying, well, this person is involved in the business operation. He's selling shoes. He's not somebody who's just coming by and fixing shelves so often. Like I said, these criteria are used to examine when we are unclear as to whether an individual is an employee or an independent contractor. These issues are usually settled up front when you're first hired for a job. It's usually made clear that you are an independent contractor or you're an employee. You actually fill out specific forms with regards to your status as an employee. There's certain tax forms that you fill out. But if it's up in the air, if it's not clear whether an individual is employee or an independent contractor, these are the items that the court looks at. So let's keep on going down the list. The next one is under the employee's direction, or are they a specialist? Is the agent under the direction of the principal, or are they a specialist? Now, what does this mean? The perfect example to think in mind is a bookkeeper versus an accountant. A bookkeeper is usually somebody who's hired on the staff and keeps the books of the operations. You know, how much is sold, how much did this cost, yada, yada, yada. Where an accountant, however, is usually hired at the end of the year to go ahead, put everything together, and make sure the taxes are filed appropriately. So keep that sort of distinction in mind. An accountant, we see that more as a specialized item where somebody's looking at everything at the end of the year to make sure that taxes are filed appropriately. Where a bookkeeper is there all year long and making sure that everything's in right order and is keeping track of the books themselves, what's going in and what's going out. The next one is, does the employer supply the tools? Let's go back to the handyman example. If you have the shoe store, but the shoe store has all the tools for fixing the shelves and for fixing the stands, and they are the ones who supply the tools to the handyman, well, the court may be inclined to think, well, since you're supplying the tools, this guy may be an employee since he's not bringing his own tools from home. The next one is the length of employment. Once again, we go back to the bookkeeper example. I'd said the bookkeeper is there all year, making sure, keeping track at the end of the day, what goes in and what goes out, where an accountant just shows up for a week at the end of the year to make sure that everything's order and files your taxes accordingly. So the length of employment is also something the court will look at in trying to determine this. The next one is method of payment, by hourly or whether job is complete. Once again, the bookkeeper example. Is the guy getting paid hourly during the day for keeping the books, or is it something like the accountant at the end of the year where you pay them, for example, $1,000 to go over all the books and things like that to make sure the taxes are filed appropriately? Is a person getting paid periodically hourly, or is it a set fee that for a set time period to be worked on? Degree of skill. This is a big one as well. And once again, it's a bookkeeper versus the accountant sort of idea. The idea is that the independent contractor is a specialist, doing something special for the business, where the degree of skill required is higher. They may be considered an independent contractor as opposed to an employee. So that is the key when trying to determine when it is unclear, when it has not been made clear in the beginning and you have filed the correct tax forms, whether an individual is an employee or an independent contractor. Now, if you go ahead in the chapter, you're going to see on page 385 the formation of an agency relationship. It's good to read through all this because it'll be on the final exam, but there's actually a very helpful table on page 388 that deals with the concept summary, the formation of the agency relationship. It's good to make sure to memorize that table because that helps explain those materials that we just went over. We'll go ahead and stop here before we go into our last video.